Narcissistic mom kicked me out at 19 for her new baby. But years later she begged me for money. So I made her believe I'd pay her debts. Then exposed her cruelty online. I 25F. Got kicked out of my house 6 years ago when my mother, 45F, and my stepdad 49M had my half-sister. My mother had me when she was really young. And her grandparents and parents were really orthodox and strict, so they forced her to have me. She hadn't even wanted to tell them that she was pregnant, but unfortunately, my dad didn't know it and told them before she could say anything. From what I've heard, she took the pregnancy test, and as soon as she saw that the results were positive, he called both their parents up and told them everything, because he thought that this was news that she would want to share with them. He didn't even wait to ask her, which was pretty stupid of him. But then again, that's just how my dad is. Needless to say, they broke up shortly after that. And since they were never married, it was a much easier process. My parents had met each other in college and had been together for a year when they got pregnant. But after this little thing that my dad did, my mom dumped him, but she couldn't get rid of me because her family already knew. And they said that if she terminated the pregnancy, then they would disown her. And so she had to go through with it. I know the story because she has told it to me several times and keeps reminding me how lucky I am to even be alive today, because had it been in her hands, she never would have had me. It is always such a nice thing to hear from your mother. She claims that I am the result of my dad's stupidity, which makes her even more annoyed with me than she usually would, and that's why I've been raised to make myself as invisible as possible. My grandparents and great-grandparents made sure that I was born, but they didn't account for what would happen to me. After that, my childhood was rough, to say the least. You guys already know how my mother was. But my dad was no better either. My mom hates me because she didn't want me and wouldn't have had me had it not been for family pressure. She also believes that I was the reason she couldn't go further in her career, because she also had to take care of me alongside college and work. Which is fair, I guess. But resenting me just because I was born and treating me badly as a child seems a little excessive, don't get me wrong. I wasn't deprived of anything as a child, because my grandparents were the ones paying for everything, since my dad couldn't afford to pay child support. So I had everything that I wanted. But I still got the feeling that I was nothing more than a burden to my mother. And she never did anything to make me feel otherwise. She never spoke to me kindly or showed me any affection. And even when I would achieve something, she never celebrated it with me. It was like living with a very cranky older roommate who hated you for no reason and just wanted you to go away as soon as you could. And then on the other hand, there was my father. He was much sweeter and nicer to be around as compared to my mother. But he was just as incompetent as a father. And I'm pretty sure that when I was a kid, he definitely had some drug problems. I couldn't recognize it back then. But now I'm sure that he was a pothead. He would always be doing weird things and saying weird crap to me. But I dismissed it as him trying to be funny for the most part and didn't think much of it. He would attend all the holidays and my birthdays and would have dinner with us once a month. But my mother seemed to hate him as well. And I could always hear them fighting about his behavior. My mother didn't want me, but she was stuck with me because her family had decided that my dad wasn't capable enough to take care of me, and honestly, they were not wrong. They had to decide who would raise me for the most part before I was born, and my mother's family made sure that she took the responsibility. And my dad only got to see me on the weekends. But even that would be implemented only after I was a certain age. Before I was 10 years old, I lived with my mother full time and only saw my dad a couple of times a month. But after that, I was allowed to live with him on the weekends. And it was a downgrade, because after I turned 10 years old, I realized that my dad was definitely not ready to be my father. He lived in a tiny apartment, and it was very apparent that he could not afford to live The kind of lifestyle that my mother was used to. Because he lived in poverty. And the living room had a distinct, weird smell. I also knew that he was unable to hold down a job. For long since my mother would be complaining about it. All the time she kept telling me that if my dad wasn't a complete idiot, she would have been able to pawn me off to him. For at least half the week. Instead of just the weekend. Without her family hounding her about it. At my father's place I felt well. But I didn't feel comfortable. Because I knew that having me over was putting a strain on him. Since I obviously couldn't live off of one meal a day as he did. But nevertheless, he still made an effort to cheer me up whenever I was at his place. So that's how my life was as a kid. I would have to put up with my mother and her constant reminders that I was not wanted at our house whenever I was living with her. And on the weekend I would have to deal with my dad in the kind of state that he was in. And then when I was around 15, my mother started dating my stepdad Jeffrey. He was not a bad guy, but he was not a good guy. He was simply just indifferent to me. And if I'm being honest, that was just much better than my mother and my dad. He didn't talk to me, I didn't talk to him. And it was all peaceful anyway. They were together for a few years. And then when I was 17 they got married. 2 years later they announced that they were pregnant. And I wasn't really concerned about it. Because it had nothing to do with me. I was still going on with my life. And sticking to my routine. As usual, but I had no idea what was about to come. When I was 18 I decided to take a gap year. Instead of going to college. And get some work experience for later. I regret that decision. I should have just gone to college. When I had the chance to. Because my grandparents were ready to pay for it. But a few months after my 18th birthday, my mother and her parents got into a very bad fight. Because of some stupid little thing that I don't even remember. And they stopped speaking to each other. This also meant that they stopped sending money for me. And I was on my own. But thankfully I was working as an intern at the time. So I was getting some money. On my 19th birthday I started applying to colleges. And my mother was 7 months along at the time. Even then she didn't tell me anything about what was going to happen when my half-sister was born. However, just a week after my half-sister was born, and my mother had come home from the hospital, she and Jeffrey sat me down and told me that they had something important to tell me. I was kind of taken aback, because I couldn't imagine anything that my mother had to say to me that could lead to anything good. Because when they started talking to me, they told me that they needed the rooms in the house. Because now that my half-sister was born, they were going to hire a full-time nanny. And they needed to give her a room to stay. There was the master bedroom, which my mother and Jeffrey used to stay in. There was my room and there was a guest room as well. But my mother told me that they were going to repaint the guest room and make it into a nursery. And of course, they couldn't let anybody into their own bedroom. So it was about time that I left the house. Because I was already 19 and as an adult, I had no reason to be living with my parents still. Because it was getting weird. And they needed their privacy. I thought that it was quite shocking. Because even though I was an adult legally, I still needed a home. Because I was going to have to come back from college eventually, and then I would need a place to go. I told my mother about it. And she said that whenever I needed to come back, I could just go live with my dad. But that was not possible because at the time, my dad had turned into a serious addict. Not only did he have a drug problem, which was bad even if it was just weird, he had also developed a gambling addiction. And his home was just not the kind of place anybody would want to go to. And I obviously couldn't go live with my grandparents, because they were not on speaking terms with my mother. And if they didn't want to speak to my mother, there was no chance that they would want to speak to me. Because to them I was just an extension of my mom. This is also the reason why I'd never had to worry about money before. Because since my grandparents wanted to take care of my mother, they also wanted to take care of me. But once their relationship was over, so was ours, and I knew this. Because I tried to get back in touch with them. Several times, but with no luck. It was bad enough that I was getting kicked out. But I also had to start thinking about how I was going to pay my way through college. Because while I was applying, had just assumed that my mother would do it for me. I knew she hated me, but I thought that going to college would mean that I would be away from her and the family and wouldn't want it to be that. But when she told me that she was kicking me out of the house, I asked her if she would be willing to pay for me to go to college. And she just laughed in my face and said that not only was she kicking me out, but she was also cutting off any ties that she had with me, because she had done her time. And now that she was not even in touch with her parents anymore, she had no reason to keep me with her. I was shocked that anyone could be capable of being so cruel, and I ended up crying. But she just made a face and told me that if I was going to cry, she would rather have me do it outside of the house, because I was ruining the vibe of what was supposed to be an otherwise happy day. Before that day I had never said anything to my mother, because I just didn't want to argue with her or waste my own time, but that day I decided to stand up for myself, because I was not going to get kicked out of the house. Silently I would go kicking and screaming, but I would let her know exactly what I thought of her. I told her that she was a terrible mother, and had always been one, and I was actually glad that I was getting rid of her finally, and that I would share that my life would be much better off without her. To that she just turned around and told me that she didn't care about any of it, and she just wanted me to leave, because now that she and her husband had a real daughter, she didn't need me anymore, and I was just as unwanted as I was before, if not more so. I broke down once again, and I think it was pretty much the worst day of my life. But I still collected myself a little while later, packed my things and left the house, never to look back again. Once I had left, I headed straight to my dad's place, and I knew that no matter what state he was in, I was going to correct it and make the best of my situation, because I was not going to let both my parents and their lackadaisical attitude ruin my life. Once I got there, I realized that my dad was in pretty bad shape, and his house was even worse. I couldn't even tell the last time it had been cleaned thoroughly from the looks of it. There was trash all over the floor, and he probably hadn't even showered in a really long time. By then, I knew that he hadn't had a job for almost a year. At that point he was losing money left and right, because he had a gambling addiction. He was lucky that his dad had passed away a couple of months ago, and had left him a bunch of money, which he was now squandering. As soon as I reached, my dad tried to tell me that he was happy to see me, but he was too high to actually say anything. He just smiled at me and thought that it would be enough. But I was not in the mood. I had already been having a very bad day, and I just couldn't deal with it anymore. He had a joint that he was smoking, so I walked up to him and I smacked it out of his hands, because I was going to make sure that he stood up as a parent and did everything for me that he hadn't been doing for as long as I was alive. I was not going to let his bad habits ruin my life. So I told him that I was here to stay for good, because my mother had kicked me out, and now he had to make up for everything that he hadn't done for me, and really clean up his act. He thought that I was kidding, and tried to pick his joint up off the floor. But that's when I lost my temper, and ended up slapping my dad right across the face. I regret it, I shouldn't have done that. But I was losing my mind about my future, and I just lost sight of what was important in that moment, so I ended up doing that. But it didn't lead to anything bad, so I guess it was meant to happen. When I slapped him I immediately started apologizing, but he was really mad. So he went back into his room and shut the door. There was only one room to begin with, so I decided to stay in the living room. But the next morning, my dad was the one who came to me and asked me what exactly had happened the previous night. He had sobered up by then, so I told him everything in great detail. And I told him that now I needed his help, and I wanted him to clean up his act, because I wanted a better future for myself. and for that I would need his help in cooperation. So he couldn't just gamble and stay high all day like he was used to. He was a little shocked that my mother had kicked me out and called her up to ask about it. But she didn't respond, so that was the day that it was decided that I would live with him. And since he had no money, he could not afford to send me to college. But he promised me that he would try his best to be a better father to me, because that slap had really brought him back to his senses. In a major way, it wasn't easy, and it was an uphill climb from that point onwards. And my dad relapsed into his old habits several times in the course of the next couple of years. But I still stuck by him, and he promised me that he would try and keep getting better. I couldn't go to college, but I couldn't waste my time at home either. So I decided to apply to a few companies for internships, and I got picked in a few of them. They paid well, but not enough to sustain a nice lifestyle or to pay for college, because if I did apply to college, I would have to go and quit my internship, and then I would have no money. I wasn't ready to take out a student loan, because at the time I wasn't sure if my dad would be able to do better in life, and I didn't want to dig a hole for myself that I couldn't get out of. So I stuck to working, and whenever I was not working, I was doing the household chores, because the house had to be clean, and I couldn't allow my dad to live the way he had been living for so long. I was not the only one who was looking for jobs, and my dad was also doing the same. But since he hadn't been working for a really long time, and he had a bit of a reputation because of his previous employers who didn't like him because he was always high on the job, he found it much more difficult than me. And it was a lot more frustrating for him as well, because his daughter was bringing home money, but he wasn't, and that was bound to get on his nerves. However, neither of us had anywhere to go. So in spite of everything, we had to stick with each other and deal with everything together. And then finally, around 3 years ago, something great finally happened to us. My dad was working as a store manager, but it barely paid and the hours were long. I was working as an accountant, and it paid slightly better, but it was a very tedious desk job. However, one of my friends who lived in a different state told me that her father was expanding his business and opening up a new location in my city. This friend of mine, Aggie, had known me since we were in middle school together. Her parents got divorced, and she moved to a different state with her father. But she comes back for the holidays every year to meet her, and that's when we get together usually. She knew everything about me, and she knew what kind of trouble I had been through in the past few years. She had even offered to help me out with college tuition, but I couldn't take money from her, because then I would know that I owed her money, and I couldn't live with that. I had refused to take money from her and her father, even though they were happy to help me and were quite rich since her dad had a large-scale office supplies business. They made the decision to branch out recently, and she contacted me to let me know that she had a job offer for me, because she knew that I was looking for something. I was a little scared that she was doing this as a favor to me, and I asked her about it, and she said that her dad wouldn't have usually considered somebody of my age for a position like this. She had talked him into it because she knew that I could do it, and I just had the drive and ambition. She trusted me and knew that I was capable enough to handle it. It was technically a favor, but she reassured me that she also had faith in me, which is why she was doing me this favor. So she asked me to become the corporate liaison for them, and I was happy to accept that position. It came with much better pay, and I would have to work longer hours, but I was glad to do it. I also asked her if she would have an opening for my dad, and given his qualifications and past work experience, they decided to make him the warehouse manager, because he had experience in that field, and it worked in that position before. So we were sorted, and that was the first time that something good happened to us. Since then things have only gone well, and my dad and I are doing much better now. He is off. We completely and doesn't gamble anymore either. We have moved into a much better house, in a nicer neighborhood, and have been living here for the past 2 years. Things are going super well and I couldn't ask for more. Really, 6 years ago, I wouldn't even have imagined myself in this place. But yet here I am. As for my mother, I didn't have any contact with her after I left the house, and have no idea what she has been up to all these years. But 2 weeks ago, she contacted me and told me that she needed my help. She sounded pretty desperate, and I could tell that something serious had happened. So I decided to hear her out. So apparently, my mother had quit her job shortly after I had left, and she and Jeffrey had started a business of their own. But unfortunately, it had been flopping for a really long time. And I don't know why, but they kept investing in it and putting money into a place where they knew they were not getting any returns. So surprisingly, they ended up going broke. And now they had a bunch of debt. And they were selling everything to repay everybody that they had taken money from. But then they were falling short. My mother had heard from a relative that my dad and I had moved into a better house. So she had assumed that we were doing well now. So she thought that it would be a good idea to call me up and ask for help. She didn't even apologize. She just said that we should put everything in the past and keep our differences aside, because this was not just about her. She also had a little daughter whose future was at stake. And if I had any kindness in my heart at all, then I would help them out and pay off some of their debts. I thought it was very gutsy of her to ask me for help after what she had put me through. And just to mess with her, I decided to agree with her on the phone call and play along. But truth be told, I had no intention of actually giving her any money or paying off any of her debts. I still told her that I was going to look into it and help her out just because I was feeling petty. So for a few days, I led her on and talked to her every day while she told me about her finances and stuff. I heard her out, knowing that I was not going to contribute in any way whatsoever, and this was just a farce. But she didn't know it, and I kept waiting for her to apologize or something. But that apology never came either, and that made me feel a lot less guilty about what I was about to do. And then 2 days ago she finally asked me when I was going to send the money to her. So I told her the truth, that I was not going to send any money to her, and that she had been played. I reminded her of what she had put me through all those years ago, and not just that, but the way she had behaved with me throughout my childhood. She was a fool to expect that I was going to help her out after everything that happened. And she hadn't even apologized to me. So she had no reason to expect anything from me. She was an awful human being and a terrible mother. And I was going to make sure that everybody knew about it. So I hung up before she could say anything and made a post about all of it. I narrated my entire story and even included the part where my mother had come to me 2 weeks ago begging me for help and acting as if she was entitled to money and contribution. It was just ridiculous and stupid of her, and I wanted everybody to know about it, which is why I did it. I personally don't see anything wrong with it, but my dad thinks that I took it way too far and that I shouldn't have done it. I don't know what my mother's reaction to it was, because after that phone call, I pretty much blocked her everywhere. But I know that my relatives can still see the post, and everybody who knew my mother now knows what she's been up to and how she treated me in my childhood. I think it was necessary for me to expose my mother, because she had always pretended that she was a really sweet person and a successful, career-driven woman, but well, that was a lie now, and I think I did the right thing. But my dad thinks that I shouldn't have said anything to her and just ignored her the first time that she approached me for help, instead of playing along and stuff, because that's just cruel, and I'll admit it. It was cruel, but that was the intention behind it. She had been cruel to me all my life. I think this was fair game, and I'm not in a movie. I don't need to do everything right and set an example for other people. I can just do what I want. But anyway, my dad thinks that I took it too far, and now he's insisting that I apologize. So I'd her for promising my estranged, toxic mother that I would help her pay off her debts. But then backing out of the last minute. And then exposing her online. Update 1. Hey, so I took the advice that most of you had for me and decided to reset my dad down and talk to him about it, and it actually worked. Which was nice. He hadn't really been an active father for most of my childhood or any of it. To be honest, he was always just high and didn't seem to care about anything. So obviously he didn't remember most things. But then I reminded him how awfully my mother used to treat me and how I basically had nobody, because even though he liked having me around, he was not exactly there for me. And that managed to make him realize that what I did, it was coming from a place of anger and resentment. And I had been battling it up for ages now. So what I did was not the right thing to do. And it was definitely not the moral or ethical thing to do, but if it gave me frustration and anger of all those years an outlet, it was probably good for me. So he understood and stopped saying that I needed to apologize to my mother. She never apologized to me for anything that she put me through. And on top of that, she had the audacity to expect me to help her out. It was entitlement on another level altogether. She hasn't contacted me after that. And it's been almost a week. I know everybody's talking about it, because I have received a lot of messages asking about my mom, but I'm not really interested in talking to other people about it. I posted whatever I had to say. I have nothing more to add. And now I have a lot of work to do as well. So I don't have time for this drama. What's done is done, and it's over. Now update 2. So my mom finally reached out to me today. After almost 2 weeks of being no contact. She didn't have much to say. She just told me that she never should have trusted me, and that she regretted ever having a child like me. But it's fine, the feeling is mutual. I also regret having a mother like her. And I would rather have been an orphan than have spent my childhood with her. She told me that thanks to my little post, she couldn't live in this town anymore. And I decided to move away, because shame and embarrassment were just way too much. So I finally got what I wanted according to her. But honestly, I don't really care where she is. She and I haven't been in touch for a really long time. And it makes no difference to me where she lives. So that's something that she's very wrong about. But it's okay, she's a narcissist. And she has a tendency to make everything about herself. So this is no big surprise anyway. I'm just glad that she's moving away. And that I don't have to talk to her again, because she's blocked me. Update 3. Hey, so it's been a month since my mother moved away. And things have been quiet. We don't have any contact anymore. But I heard from a few of my relatives that she has apparently got her entire family off and is not speaking to anybody. Good for her, I guess. My dad and I are still doing great, and in fact, my dad just got a raise. So it's all good and I can't complain.